Well, I must say first that it was one of the most beautiful lectures I heard about the advantages of genetically modified organisms. I heard some lectures by biologists in previous times, but I must say that yours was far more convincing. And when I prepared this comment, my idea was, oh, if one day you are suffering from unemployment, you will be immediately recruited by Monsanto. And I heard later that in fact you have already connections. But the second problem, I think, is that it's very difficult to comment because you have a huge expertise in this field. And when you are, I am a biologist, but not an expert in genetically modified organisms. I am also interested by history and philosophy of science, but, well, it's difficult to really argue against you. So I will not do that, but more maybe do comment or extend your talk in directions you have not really addressed, more philosophical, maybe issues and issues at the boundary between what you described and other wider fields. So I will focus on 2 points. The first is organic agriculture or farming. And I was somehow surprised that you did not give a definition of what is organic farming, organic agriculture, because I think personally, for me, it's not obvious to have a definition. I think, in addition, that is probably diverse, different from one country to another, one continent from another. You know that in France we have another expression, it's not organic farming or organic agriculture, it's biological agriculture. And I always personally wondered what might be an agriculture would not be biological. So that's a problem. And from your lecture, I had the feeling that you were telling that somehow organic farming is the form of farming which was existing, let's say, 1 or 2 centuries ago. Or at least it's the efforts to somehow reconstitute this form of farming, but keeping progresses which were done since, for instance, new crops, and also maybe avoiding some of the defects which has been clearly revealed by the recent development in agriculture. So it would be a kind of mixing, somehow return towards the past, but keeping progresses which have been done and since during the last 2 centuries, and in addition avoiding some of really the problems that we see, for instance, the treatment of animals, the way they are slaughtered and so on. So it's kind of mixed attempt to make agriculture slightly different. But maybe later you can comment and come back on this. I think for me it's not so much clear at this point so far. And the second question about organic farming is a point you raised. The percentage of organic farming is not increasing, despite some efforts, even from the governments, to increase the part. And why? Why is organic farming not developing more? You say the yields are not maybe optimal, but since you have these subsidies, one might think that it's not a serious problem. So are there other reasons why organic farming is not developing faster? So it was my first question about organic farming compared to other forms of agriculture. And the second point was on more genetically modified organisms, plant crops. And first you say, and I personally fully agree, that it's not a problem of being natural or not natural. And I think it's for organic farming, but also for genetically modified crops. And it's not a good question, or at least it's another question, but a very difficult and probably a question is more, it's not the best thing to enter into it. So there is another question, more modest, I think, is this way to produce crops different from the traditional ways to produce crops? So it's not a question of being natural or not, but different. And if you look at the discussions which somehow took place about a genetically modified organism, I think the first focus was on the nature of the variations. And somehow, if we consider, since Darwin, that transformation occurs by variation and selection, we can ask a question: what is new? Is it in the modification process, or is it in the selection process? And I think most of the discussion focused on the modification process. Introducing DNA into a plant is something which is very different from what happens before. But now that variation, mutation are best known, I think it has been discovered that in fact what this unique word mutation covers very different processes, including transfer of full DNA molecule from one organism to the other. So, in fact, introduced DNA as it is done today is not different from what occurs in between organisms. So, from the point of view of variations, I think it's clear that now there is no difference. There is a difference only if one considers that there is no DNA in the crops, which apparently is a common opinion in the population. More than 50 people think that there is no DNA in crops and vegetables. So in this case, obviously, it's something very different. But otherwise, I think the variations are not different. But now let's turn maybe to the second part of the process of transformation, which is selection. And in fact, selection, it's not natural selection. But it's not different from the selection of plants, crops, which have been done during centuries. It's an artificial selection, which was distinguished by Darwin from natural selection. So there is also not a difference in selection, not in variation, not in selection, but maybe not a qualitative difference, but maybe there is a quantitative difference. And in particular, selection with this new way to producing crops, you have two differences, I think. The first is the fact that it will be more centralized. You will have production of a very limited number of crops, plants. You mentioned this point already, the decrease in genetic richness in the number of genetic pool. But I think one possibility would be the disappearance of natural genes allowing resistance to disease. And if you have too much concentration, independently of the loss of many genes, the risk is to have a new crop which would be sensitive to a new virus, for instance, and in this case there will be no resistance. So maybe with this new process of producing crops, you have somehow a leap in the, let's say, in the decrease of the genetic pool, which was not existing before. And the second point is the rhythm of variation, because I think even selection of crops as it existed in the past century was a very long process. And now you have a selection which takes artificial selection in few months. And my question is not such the result different from these two variations, in the fact that you have more concentration on one plant, and you have also a faster rhythm of variation. So, maybe it's a difference, not qualitative difference, but a quantitative difference that must be taken into account. So, well, these were my two comments.
Thank you very much. Our second speaker will be Professor Gayon, also from the IHPST in Paris.
Thank you, John. Paul, just as Michel was, I was astounded by your talk, which was absolutely superb, and which has people thinking differently, because while the majority of people speaking of GMOs and Monsanto and the likes do not go in the direction that you have chosen. So I think it needs some courage, and the amount of information, ideas, arguments that you've gathered is just marvelous. And there is even more in your book, published at Cambridge University Press, which I take as a sort of Bible. I don't mean that I agree with all arguments, but you know, I know of no book so well done on the subject. Okay, now I have 5 minutes, 5 questions, brief but big questions. My questions are open except for 2 that will involve some iron. 5 questions: scientific, technical, economic, ethical, and political. No, I have to find something to tell just to attract attention, even if there is nothing in it. So,
15 seconds to answer the whole.
So, scientific. Well, GMOs are based on a very particular class of genetic phenomena. They are based, well, in the present state, on genes that alone, or perhaps with one or 2 of the genes, produce a massive effect. Thus, we are in a situation similar to medical genetics, where you may have diseases that are almost univocally produced by one mutation. This exists, but it's extremely rare. The common situation in genetics is networks, epigenetics, complexity, and even when you have one gene that does something of a generation, the network will maybe just change everything. So my first question is scientific. So GMOs produce marvelous, impressive technical effects, but I'm not sure that the kind of science it's based on will have a future that will. I don't think that it's so much promising for the future. My second question is technical. It's related to the last one, but it takes us a little closer to politics and in the sense of policy of research. I did this objection from a number of people, mainly agricultural scientists, geneticists, and evolutionists. Leontine is one of these. And the argument consists in saying that for a century, since say 1920, the biggest amount of research in favor of for genetic improvement has been based on hybridization and now on GMOs. And they say, well, a lot of money have been invested in this area by private companies, by national agencies, etc. Okay. And it has produced effect, of course. But are we sure that we might not have been able to attain the same goals or similar goals with procedures based on artificial selection? And well, probably yes, but the economic effect is not the same, because as you know, hybridization and GMOs are something quite important for capitalistic companies that want to keep control of what they obtain. Whereas if you obtain it through selection, I'm not sure that it would be so easily controlled. Well, of course, in these research programs, there is also always a mixture of hybridization and of selection. But I think, well, for a century, it has gone in one direction, and so that's my second question. My third question is economic. At a certain point in your exposition, you said that you were you spoke about the concentration, I thought, the concentration of control of the seed production, and I would also say, and use. You say production and distribution, and I would say production and use. And this is related to something that has been extremely popular among anti-GMO, anti-GMO agriculture. You said, I do worry about this. You began like this. I do worry about this. And then you told a story. Well, I'm glad to buy the seeds for my potatoes. And what's the problem? Well, the problem is, you know, it's a little, and you said, well, we must have a wider picture. Okay, there have been some little scandals, but look at the wide picture. And I would tell you what, look at Dominique Strauss-Kahn, excellent economist, excellent director of the International Monetary Fund. It is just for a small sexual detail that he killed himself. So, well, extrapolate to Monsanto and you understand what I mean. When a company begins suing someone who accidentally got the seed in his garden, did not buy it, doesn't want it, and is sued. Well, you know, this is the kind of thing that can socially kill a certain program. So I would like to know about your potatoes and Monsanto. Ethical, that's a huge issue, and I know that you are very much concerned about it. And it's a question that comes naturally from your talk, but you did not raise it, or obliquely. You said, well, we have a problem with demography for 2 centuries since the agriculturalist revolution. So finally, Malthus was wrong, and we are getting more and more numerous. And how can we feed all these people? And GMOs may be a decent solution. Well, okay, but I would like, if you're allowed to say a word, a single word, I would like to have your position on demography. You know, of course, we must feed all these people, but is it so sacred, so dangerous that we cannot speak about it if this is a problem? And my last question is, that's provocation, it's more political. So the spirit of your talk and its marvelous argumentation, it's, well, you know, you look at the argument, there's no problem. On the whole, we have a problem, there are good solutions, some little problems, there's no problem. But my problem is, well, why are there millions of billions, no, maybe not billions, but 100 millions of people saying, we don't want it, and my question is, why? You spoke about medicine and food, there was something interesting there. So I suggest that the problem may be not only a scientific and technical problem, maybe elsewhere, and if you can say something about this in a future book, I would be glad.
Thank you very much. Professor Michael Winter next from the Exeter Centre for Law Research.
Thank you very much, John. Yes, we've had 2 interventions that are very much focused on the GM issue, but your paper was much broader than that. I also enjoyed it enormously. But I want to suggest that your self-professed profession of pluralism, that you perhaps weren't pluralist enough. And I want to start with your identification of the problem in the first place, because you started by saying that it was very much around 2 crucial factors of population growth and increasing affluence. And I would suggest that there are some other crucial factors that lead actually to more pluralist solutions than just GM or organic. And I know you weren't saying it's just GM or organic. Climate change is clearly one of them. That underlies a lot of the direction of change that we'll need in agriculture. Fossil fuel dependency is clearly another, and fossil fuel dependency, particularly in the kind of agriculture you're talking about, is very great indeed. I think also that once you sort of accept that the problem is much broader than just those 2, you begin to think of sort of more pluralist solutions. So let's look at 1 or 2 of the factors that you didn't mention in that identification of the problem, beyond those 2 of climate change and fossil fuel dependency. One of them is if we have an increased population to feed of maybe 9 billion, we have to look at waste, for example, in the food system. reckoned to be 30%, 40% maybe, different parts of the world for very different reasons along the whole of the food chain. I think we also have to look at what lies, I'm surprised you didn't mention it, I'm sure you're more than well aware of it, but what lies behind the issue of increasing affluence is the so-called nutrition transition. I mean, you obviously kind of obliquely referred to it in talking about meat, and people eating more meat and dairy products and various other things as they get more affluent. That clearly increases the land take and the requirement for land and requirement for the kind of crops that feed those animals. I don't think, whilst I wouldn't go with the Soil Association in this country that has just said, oh, we don't take any notice of the nutrition transition, we just want people to eat sensibly. You know, people will eat what they will eat, but I do think we need to challenge the way our diet is going, and this is this pluralist kind of set of solutions I think we're looking for. So tackling waste would be one, tackling dietary change would be another. I think also looking at non-conventional food crops, particularly around perennials, or around algae, around fish. You mentioned fish in passing, but I think there's we've had a very, very bad track record in terms of farming fish, both marine and freshwater, but I think there are ways of improving that. Again, it's part of the pluralist solution. So I think, and another big issue is competing land uses. So in other words, what I'm saying is the problem actually I think is bigger than you set out. If it was only population and increasing affluence, I think it would be quite tackable, easy to tackle even within conventional plant breeding. It's because it's all these other things I think it is so challenging. So competing land uses for biofuels and so on and so forth as well. So I think it's in that context, I'm actually with you quite a bit of the way in terms of being sympathetic to GM as part of the solution. Incidentally, I don't think that GM is necessarily complete, and I think you alluded to this, completely at the opposite end of the spectrum to organic. And in fact, if you talk to organic farmers as opposed to their self-elected spokesman, they're quite often quite sympathetic to good organic, good GM kind of development. So I think there's some interesting issues there. I want to defend organic a little bit though, because I've had a lot of time for organics in many ways. One thing I think where you were a little bit naughty, you seemed to conflate, you knew what you were doing, you conflated the livestock industry and all the attendant problems of livestock with organics. Now, come on, if only 1 or 2% of our food production is organic, then only 1 or 2% of livestock production is organic. So I think that was a little mischievous, and the problem of livestock. I mean, you're right, it is a huge problem. I think again, we need to look for solutions to some of that, unless we're going to assume people aren't going to eat meat. I want to reduce meat consumption, but I don't think it's going to go away. It actually, and this is very much a kind of Western European point, it has a very important role, I think, in our part. Come out with me. You're probably doing other things tomorrow, but come to West Devon, where I live, and see how wet it is. It grows grass. It probably would grow trees very well as well, so maybe there's some interesting issues there, but it grows grass, and I don't like eating grass. It's best if it's turned into animal flesh, along with other things. And actually some of our most prized biodiversity, certainly in this country, and you're absolutely right, I mean there's nothing natural in terms of any of the prized environments that we have. Some of our most prized biodiversity in Western Europe is dependent on livestock grazing, and I don't think it's. I don't think it's entirely true to suggest that. I don't think you were, but there's a sort of slight hint that agriculture somehow is an automatic kind of, direct relationship between biodiversity and agricultural intensity. I mean, there's certain types of agriculture actually increase biodiversity. I mean, certainly great. What would you prefer, a mono crop of beech trees on chalk, or the sort of floristically rich grazed chalk downland, grazed by sheep? I mean, so there are some. In other words, you can eat biodiversity by eating meat. So there's some positive land use implications of livestock, but much reduced consumption, I would say. I think of one or two. I'm finishing it, John. I'm probably going on far too much. So I do think this critique of livestock farming conflated with organic is naughty. I also think that the greenhouse gas issue and livestock has hit us very, very fast. Really, 4 or 5 years ago, I think we have to invest some research time and effort into that, and certainly there's a lot of research going on looking at diets of animals in an effort to reduce that. I also think we have to invest a lot of research, and quite a bit is going on what we do with that livestock waste. It doesn't automatically always end up in waterways. I mean, if you compost it, it's got a much better chance of staying in the right place in the soil. If you actually anaerobically digest it and just use the digestate, you've got better control. So there are some smart solutions to some of these issues, which I think need to be recognised. I think also, as far as organic goes, and quite a few of these other possible solutions, perennial crops, for example, we've not made the investment in research and development that we have in more conventional agriculture. There's been you go to places like Rothamsted, which I know well, and various other agricultural research institutes in this country, you see very, very little research going on organic systems. And I think that's a danger. So I think all I'm really saying, by way of conclusion, is great. I enjoyed it. I'm kind of absolutely up there for the GM debate. I think I'm in favour of GM in certain ways, in certain contexts, but I think it's got to be part of an even more plural solution than you alluded to. But you didn't have sort of 4 hours to talk, so I'm sure you would accept some of those points, if not all. Thanks.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Berris from Egenis.
So thanks very much, Paul, for having come on us this way and laid out a rather exposed argument for us all to sink our teeth into. And thanks to John and Sabina for inviting me to respond. So I've not got anything very substantial to add in 10 minutes, just some rather superfluous frothy thoughts, which will hopefully add to the debate in a second. And I've grouped them under 3 sets of headings. So firstly, I've got some points to make about history of innovation. Secondly, I've got some points to make about intellectual property and commercialisation. And then finally, some points about agricultural systems. And I should also thank the other respondents for having used up all of the good points. But nevertheless. So, history of innovation. And the idea that I want to get across here really could be sloganised, if you like, to say, why should we always expect the latest technology to be the greatest or the most productive? And this is a point which is very familiar to historians of technology. David Egerton has a nice book which you only really need the title of. It's called The Shock of the Old. And I think we can put some quite specific agricultural flesh onto this example by pointing to the success of Dutch agriculture. Now, there's still a great deal of debate about exactly what does or doesn't make Dutch agriculture successful or not. But it's interesting to see what other people point to when they look at this situation. So the USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service produced a grain report in 2005, and what they said was a good geographical location, an excellent infrastructure, and a very professional industry were the main ingredients for this Dutch situation. And I think infrastructure and professionalism speak to 2 technologies which are so old we don't really recognise them as being technologies, bureaucracy and extension. But we could also add to this list advances in high-pressure sodium lighting, hydroponic culture, or even the types of nutrients that's being used. So, as I said, I didn't want to suggest that I'm providing a definitive answer on Dutch agriculture, but I think it's interesting to point at the very broad range of factors that are highlighted there, and some quite old technologies. And there's a related point we can make about history of technology here. So we tend to remember the big technological innovations and the inventors responsible for them. But on another view of the history of technology, it's actually the incremental innovations which add the productive force or gains in yields that we need in this sort of situation that Paul's outlined for us. So that's one set of comments. Under history of innovation, why should we expect the latest technology to be the greatest? Or indeed, why shouldn't we expect small incremental innovations to be just as important as the big pin-up innovation moments? So, forecasting where innovations will occur is something akin to soothsaying. And there's a huge amount of serendipity in the way in which certain technologies and innovations arrive. But of course, we have a legislative system in place to encourage types of innovation, and that's the intellectual property system that we have. So my next set of comments about IP and commercialisation, and this is really drawing on something that Paul's already mentioned and Jean has also mentioned. I think it would be easy to think of Monsanto or Syngenta in the last decade or so as having been some kind of aberration. And there's actually some nice historical evidence that commercial nurseries and seed breeders have quite frequently been involved in these sorts of activities. So Daniel Kevels has some nice work on the Stark Brothers nurseries. The Stark Brothers nurseries were very vocal in calling for the 1930 Plant Patent Act, which was the first Plant Patent Act on biological materials. And they also hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency. This was a very unpleasant outfit which associated with strike breaking and communist witch hunts in America. And the Stark Brothers were hiring them to enforce licenses which they made their buyers sign at the point of purchase. So it seems there's some evidence that this type of activity is ongoing. And in the contemporary situation, certainly, say, Plantum NL, which is the main association of small-scale Dutch plant breeders, have pointed out specifically that they see this shift from plant breeders' rights, which allowed some access for small-scale breeders and farmers, to patents on new varieties as being one of the key problems in the plant breeding sector at the moment. So, on a slightly more sympathetic analysis of this type of activity, plant breeding is very expensive quite often. You need a lot of land and you need a lot of money. And genetic plant breeding is probably even more expensive. You have to have an appropriate laboratory with appropriate safety procedures in place. So why shouldn't we expect the Monsantos and the Syngentas of the world to be just as creative as they can in trying to recoup as much of that money as possible through the intellectual property system? Well, that's all well and good, but it doesn't make GMO technology and research any cheaper. So, on the one hand, why should we look to the latest technology to be the most important? And secondly, why should we look to the most expensive technologies to be the most important? And here I can gesture in a very facile way to the introduction of the humble turnip into British agriculture. Introducing turnips where previously farmers had used a third of the year for fallow, it increased European agricultural production by a third in one fell swoop. Okay, so that's a set of comments under IP and commercialisation. Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about agricultural systems, and once again I've been beaten to these comments by Paul, Jean and Michael this time. But I think we could bring together some of what Jean and Michael were saying. And obviously, Paul wasn't suggesting that there is only GM and there is only organic, and that these two systems are somehow necessarily in competition with each other. And indeed, given the ambiguity over organic certification, the idea of GM organic isn't quite as oxymoronic as it sounds. But rightly or wrongly, the biggest obstacle to the introduction of GMOs in Europe, anyway, has been political unpopularity. And that's something we've not mentioned so far today. So if political unpopularity for the purposes of this discussion is off the table, then why don't we look at some really unpopular interventions? And it seems to me, and I think Paul mentioned this, the core problem with conventional agriculture is the excessive production and consumption of meat. And I think it might be a little bit wrong-headed to think that instead of addressing this problem, we should be making further technological interventions around the periphery so that we can sustain something which looks very unsustainable. And while, all right, enforced vegetarianism might not be possible with any amount of political popularity or goodwill, and I say this jokingly, but there is some precedent for this. In wartime we have rationing. Why not let the cost of meat at the point of consumption reflect something like the cost of meat at the point of production? Because the only reason we have this unsustainable production of meat is because it is so heavily subsidised. Why don't we roll back those subsidies? Okay, so 3 comments. Why should we expect the latest thing to be the greatest thing, the most expensive thing to be the greatest thing? And I think the Smiths already sloganized my 3rd point for me. Meat is murder. Thank you so much.
Right. Well, thank you all very much. It's like the impossible situation because despite your excellent timekeeping, which thank you all, we have only 20 and a few minutes, and I'm sure you could probably spend twice that answering all the questions that have just come up. So I think what I'll suggest is perhaps if you would like to join the other panelists here and just maybe take really a few minutes to respond to anything that you particularly would not want to pass, but with us all understanding that you couldn't possibly respond to all of the points that we made. So maybe just if you'd like to pick out a couple of things that you'd most like to reply, then perhaps open it up to do what you think.
Okay. Tough decision.
It is.
Anyway, thank you. Great comments. And I don't think there's a huge amount of disagreement on almost all of the issues. What it suggests is that this is an incredibly complex landscape. And any kind of slice you take of it to try to figure some stuff out is going to be a distortion of the total landscape. So let me say, not plural stuff? Well, yeah, quite clearly. I mean, you are absolutely right. Climate change is coming at us like an incredibly fast locomotive. Fossil fuel dependence, I mean, all the things in your list, I think, are part of what we have to consider. And the pluralist just has to stay open to a huge array of potential issues as well as potential solutions. So again, my pluralism would embrace a lot of what you're saying in terms of the potential ways in which you've got to not just go for the flashes. I would say you said the most expensive and the latest, but just even the flashes, because it seems like a great thing where it's advertised to death. There are lots of ways in which, with incremental changes, we can make a difference. And this relates both to the population comment as well as the meat comment. We are going to have to do some unpopular things. I mean, it's just plain and simple. We are not going to be able to continue with the kind of political dynamic we have now, where a little bit of squeakiness suddenly means that politicians begin to back off difficult decisions. Population, we are going to have to, as humanely as we can, come to terms with slowing down, if not declining, our population. And I think we have to stop subsidies on meat. It's just as we keep ratcheting up petrol prices in order that you can have a sustainable source and you cut down on demand. Every time petrol prices go up in North America, big cars get sold and little cars begin to dominate the market. So there really is that kind of effect. I don't really have time to talk about the difference, what I think is organic and what kinds of differences I think that's an important point. Organic is all over the place. So any concept, I mean, the meaning is all over. It depends on what country you're in. It depends on which particular region, who's responsible for defining it or certifying it. And I don't have a clean answer for that. It's a good question, because just using the word means it covers over a multitude of those differences. So let me spend just the last comment. Told not to need to respond to everything. There is one that gets under my skin. And Jean raised this, and I don't know whether he had in mind the example that occurred in Canada with a farmer. But what I suggest, this is Percy Schmeiser, who in Canada claims that Monsanto seed blew onto his property, that he was an organic farmer, and that Monsanto then was suing him for having it grow on his farm. Anybody who wants to know what happened there should go to the Supreme Court of Canada website. You should read the depositions of the Supreme Court and the decision of the Supreme Court. He had 1,100 acres planted in straight rows. it doesn't blow in. It may have blown in initially, because it looks as though the best story that the court, at each level of court, went through 3 court levels, the best story they could construct was that some blew in. He figured it might be Roundup ready, and so he sprayed it with Roundup, and it survived. And so he collected the seeds, and the following year he deliberately planted them. And that was a patent violation. So Monsanto sued him for this. Whether they should have or not is a different question. But he certainly wasn't just having it blown into his land. And it was set up as a test case. It was like the Scopes trial. It was set up just to sort of test whether or not patent law on organisms could stand up in Canada, whether or not there could be patent, what kind of patent settlements you would get. So it went right to the Supreme Court because of all the issues around patenting, and it really was more a test case. So there's lots of stories like that that characterize the industry negatively, that when you dig a little deeper, it turns out aren't quite so simple. So I just, because I hear the Schmeiser story all the time, but all the rest of your points I think were really good. Just that one I wasn't so keen.